wind howled through the bare trees lining the narrow road, their skeletal branches casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. As the group of friends stood at the foot of the overgrown path leading to Hallow Manor, a palpable sense of unease settled over them. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Claire muttered, hugging her arms against the biting October chill. She glanced up at the towering silhouette of the mansion, its jagged rooftop barely visible against the starless sky. The crumbling facade loomed in the distance, wrapped in creeping vines like a forgotten tombstone in an abandoned cemetery. "We've talked about this for years," Jake replied, his voice wavering just enough to betray his false bravado. "Come on, it's just a house." He grinned, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "A house where people died," said Evelyn, her voice low. She flicked the flashlight on, casting a dim beam through the dense fog rolling in from the woods. "You've heard the stories. They say the place is cursed." "Nonsense," Mark chimed in, ever the skeptic. He was the tallest of the group, always playing the role of the fearless leader. "We'll explore for an hour, maybe 2. Take some pictures, have a few laughs, and head back in time for the party. Nothing to worry about." Yet even Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the darkness. The manor's broken windows gleamed like empty eyes, staring out over the landscape, waiting. The manor had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Decades ago, it had been the site of strange disappearances. People who wandered too close never came back, or so the rumors claimed. Ghost stories whispered through the small town of Ashwick for years, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some said the family who once lived there had been involved in dark rituals. Others swore they could still hear the cries of the children who vanished on Halloween night many years ago. "Just a house," Claire echoed quietly, more to herself than anyone else. But as they crossed the rusted iron gate, the temperature seemed to plummet even further, and a strange weight pressed down on her chest. She shivered, though it wasn't entirely from the cold. They followed the narrow path to the manor, the fog swirling around their legs like grasping fingers. The closer they got, the louder the wind seemed to grow, almost like whispered voices riding on the breeze. Claire stopped in her tracks, frowning. "Did you hear that?" she asked, looking around. The others paused. "Hear what?" Mark asked, sounding annoyed. Claire strained her ears, but the sound had vanished. Just the wind. She shook her head. "Nothing, I guess." But as they approached the manor's front steps, the whispering returned, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from the house itself, low, unintelligible murmurs, as if the very walls were speaking. Jake was the first to reach the porch, his flashlight cutting through the mist as he ascended the rotting wooden stairs. "Look at this place," he whispered, running a hand over the peeling doorframe. "It's ancient." The rest of them gathered behind him, staring up at the manor's grand yet dilapidated entrance. The door, once a proud symbol of the family's wealth, was now a cracked ruin, barely hanging on its rusted hinges. Moss and rot had claimed most of the exterior, giving the whole place a sickly green hue. Above them, an old weather vane creaked ominously, turning slowly with the wind. Mark stepped forward, testing the door. To their surprise, it groaned open with little effort, the lock long broken. He shot a smug glance over his shoulder. "See? Nothing spooky about this." But as the door swung inward, revealing the dark maw of the manor's interior, a blast of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. It was as if the house was breathing, exhaling after years of suffocating silence. For a moment, no one moved. Claire could feel her pulse quicken, the strange pressure on her chest intensifying. She caught Evelyn's eye. Her friend looked pale, lips pressed into a tight line. "Last chance to back out," Jake said with a nervous laugh. But no one moved. Mark was the first to step inside, his flashlight slicing through the thick darkness. "Let's go," he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the vast emptiness. Slowly, the others followed, crossing the threshold into the cold, suffocating gloom of Hallow Manor. Behind them, the door creaked shut with a hollow thud. The whispering voices were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. And the house seemed to be waiting. The silence inside Hallow Manor was thick, oppressive, as though the air itself had forgotten how to move. Their flashlights flickered against walls draped in peeling wallpaper, casting jagged shadows that danced like ghostly figures around the room. Jake let out a low whistle. "Man, this place is worse than I thought. It's like time stopped in here." Dust hung in the air like a dense fog, disturbed only by their movements. The grand foyer they found themselves in must have once been impressive. A sweeping staircase dominated the far wall, its banister covered in a film of grime, while tarnished portraits stared down from the walls, their features faded by neglect. Evelyn swept her flashlight across the faces in the portraits, pausing on one in particular. A tall man with hollow eyes and a thin-lipped smile, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. His eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. "Creepy," she muttered, stepping back from the painting. "It's like he's staring right through us." Claire stood near the center of the room, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel it again, that pressure in her chest. The air felt different in here, heavier, as if the house itself was waiting for them to make a wrong move. "All right, where should we start?" Mark asked, his voice loud and out of place in the eerie quiet. "How about we don't?" Claire suggested, her voice a strained whisper. She hadn't liked the house from the moment they stepped onto the grounds, but now that they were inside, the feeling was worse, deeper, an instinctive kind of dread that gnawed at her. Jake ignored her, already moving toward the staircase. "Upstairs? Bet there's some old bedrooms or..." There was a sudden creak from above, loud and unmistakable. Everyone froze, flashlights darting to the ceiling. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. Evelyn nodded, taking a step closer to her. It sounded like footsteps. Mark scoffed, trying to shake off the tension that had settled over them. "This place is falling apart. It's probably just the house settling, or animals, maybe." "Yeah, animals," Jake echoed, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He glanced up the staircase again, hesitating. A faint scraping noise followed, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor above them. The sound was slow, deliberate, and it sent a cold shiver down Claire's spine. "That's not an animal," Evelyn whispered, clutching her flashlight tighter. Without another word, Mark took a step forward, as if trying to prove his own bravery. "We're here to explore, right? Let's check it out." As he reached for the banister, the front door behind them rattled. Everyone turned, the noise sharp and sudden in the tense silence. The door, which had shut so firmly behind them, now stood slightly ajar. A soft gust of wind swept in, carrying with it a faint sound, like distant laughter, echoing through the foyer. Jake stepped back, his flashlight flickering wildly. "Okay, that's weird. I closed that door. I know I closed it." Claire's throat tightened. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the house. She took a step toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But before she could say anything, it slammed shut with a violent bang. The sound reverberated through the manor, sending a shockwave of fear through the group. "Mark!" Claire's voice trembled. I don't like this. We should go. Mark hesitated, his bravado cracking under the weight of the inexplicable events. But just as he opened his mouth to respond, there was another noise, a faint creaking, followed by a slow, rhythmic thumping coming from the staircase. One by one, they turned to face the stairs. The sound grew louder, clearer. Footsteps, but heavy, dragging footsteps. Something or someone was coming down from the second floor. Jake backed away from the staircase, his face pale in the dim light. What the hell is that? They stared up at the top of the stairs, breath held, but the landing above was obscured in darkness. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark swallowed hard, his flashlight shaking slightly. Maybe it's just old wood. No, Evelyn whispered. That's not wood. There was a final creak from the top of the stairs, and in the faint beam of Claire's flashlight, she thought she saw movement, something shifting in the shadows, something watching them from the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The door behind them rattled again, this time with more force, as though something on the other side was trying to get in. Or perhaps trying to keep them from leaving. We need to go, Claire managed, her voice thick with fear. But the door wouldn't budge, and the footsteps resumed, this time faster, rushing toward them from the unseen darkness above. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving the group paralyzed in the cold silence of the foyer. Claire's breath hitched as she glanced at the others. No one spoke. Jake's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to creep along the walls like silent predators. Evelyn was the first to move. Let's get upstairs, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We need to figure out what's going on. Mark nodded, trying to regain control of the situation. Yeah, whatever it is. It's probably just the wind or the house settling. We'll check the second floor, see if there's anything there, then get out of here. Simple. Simple. The word felt absurd given the situation, but no one argued. With Jake leading the way, they ascended the stairs, the old wood groaning beneath their weight. The temperature dropped further as they climbed, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. At the top of the stairs, they were greeted by a long hallway lined with closed doors, each leading into a room that had likely not seen light in decades. Most were ajar, revealing glimpses of broken furniture, dust-covered floors, and peeling wallpaper. A sickly, suffocating stillness filled the space. Which one? Jake asked, his voice barely louder than a breath. Mark nodded toward the end of the hall. The attic. If there's anything strange going on, it'll be up there. A narrow staircase jutted out from the far corner, leading up to a small attic door. Claire hesitated, her stomach twisting into knots as her gaze lingered on the dark opening above. It felt wrong. The air was thicker here, colder. She could almost hear something, like a faint, persistent hum in the back of her mind. But none of them wanted to stay in the hallway any longer. One by one, they climbed the stairs to the attic, their flashlights bobbing through the darkness. The door at the top was slightly ajar, and Mark gave it a gentle push. It swung open with a long, drawn-out creak, revealing the cramped attic space beyond. The room was filled with old furniture draped in tattered sheets, and boxes stacked high against the walls. Dust floated through the air, disturbed by their arrival. A single small window at the far end of the attic provided the only source of light, a pale sliver of moonlight cutting through the gloom. But what drew their attention was the mirror. It stood propped against the wall near the window, tall and old, with an ornate frame covered in intricate carvings, The glass was clouded with dust, but beneath the grime, Claire could make out strange symbols etched around the edges, faded, barely visible, but there nonetheless. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, stepping closer. He reached out, wiping away a patch of dust to get a better look. His reflection stared back at him, warped slightly by the aged glass. Claire's pulse quickened as she looked at the mirror. Something about it felt wrong. The symbols around the edge were strange, almost like letters from a language she couldn't understand, twisted and looping in ways that made her dizzy just looking at them. "It's just a mirror," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the glass. For a moment they all stood there, staring at their reflections, the silence pressing down on them like a heavy weight. And then the reflection shifted. Claire blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. But there it was again, a subtle movement, as though their reflections were delayed, moving just a fraction of a second after they did. She stepped back, her heart racing. Did anyone else see that?" she whispered. Evelyn nodded, her eyes wide. "It's like..." Her voice trailed off as she stared into the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with unblinking eyes. But then the reflection smiled, an eerie, slow smile that didn't belong on Evelyn's face. "Get away from it," Claire urged, grabbing Evelyn's arm and pulling her back. The smile on her reflection lingered for a moment longer, before fading back into a blank expression. Jake stumbled back, nearly knocking over a stack of old books. What the hell was that? Mark was breathing hard, his eyes fixed on the mirror. "I don't know, but we need to leave. Now." Before anyone could argue, there was a sharp, cold gust of wind, despite the fact that the attic window was sealed shut. The air around the mirror seemed to ripple, and the symbols etched into the frame began to glow faintly, pulsing with a sickly green light. And then the whisper started again. Soft, unintelligible voices filled the attic, growing louder with every second. Claire's head throbbed, the pressure in her chest growing unbearable. It felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing around them, feeding off their fear. Without warning, the mirror began to crack. Fissures snaked across the surface of the glass, distorting their reflections into twisted, grotesque versions of themselves. The whispers grew louder, more frantic as the cracks spread. "We need to go!" Mark shouted, grabbing Jake by the arm and pulling him toward the attic door. Claire didn't need to be told twice. As they scrambled back down the narrow stairs, the mirror shattered behind them, sending shards of glass raining. The whispers followed them, chasing them through the darkness as they fled. The group stumbled down the narrow staircase, their footsteps clumsy and frantic, as though the house itself was breathing down their necks. Behind them, the echo of the mirror shattering still rang in Claire's ears, mingling with the rising whispers that seemed to surround them. "What the hell was that?" Jake gasped, nearly tripping over the last step. "I don't know, but we're not sticking around to find out," Mark snapped, his voice harsh with fear. He yanked the door to the hallway open, and they all bolted through. But the moment they stepped into the corridor, something shifted. The hallway no longer stretched in a straight line. The doorways, once spaced evenly along the walls, now seemed to twist and curve, as if the house itself had rearranged its bones. The walls were closer, narrower, and the oppressive silence that followed them upstairs was now broken by something far worse. Voices. Soft at first, like the distant murmur of a crowd in a far-off room. But as they paused to catch their breath, the whispers grew clearer, closer, rising from behind the walls themselves. It was no longer a single voice, but many. Hundreds, all whispering in strange, guttural tones. Words that didn't make sense. "They're in the walls," Claire whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "The voices, they're everywhere." Jake backed up, pressing his hands against his ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. "This can't be real. This can't..." Evelyn grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Stop. Panicking won't help. We have to stay calm, or the house will..." Suddenly, one of the doors to their left slammed shut with a violent bang, sending everyone jumping back. The whispers rose again, louder now, like a chorus of the dead. Claire swore she could feel the vibrations beneath her feet, like something slithering just beneath the floorboards. Mark shook his head, gripping his flashlight tighter. "We've got to keep moving. If we stay in one place, we'll..." Another door slammed, this one behind them. The walls seemed to ripple in response, the whispering voices growing angrier, faster. Words that Claire couldn't understand bounced off the walls, pressing in on them from all sides. Her heart pounded against her ribs, the pressure in her chest tightening like a vice. "I can't take this," Jake said, his voice rising in panic. "We're trapped. The house, it's not going to let us leave." "No!" Mark shouted, forcing his way forward. "We're not trapped. We just need to find the front door." He took a few steps down the hall, his flashlight beam flickering against the shifting shadows. But when they turned the corner, the hallway stretched farther than before. The front door, once a short distance away, was now impossibly far, as if the house had grown while they weren't looking. "This isn't happening," Claire whispered, her throat tight with fear. "This can't be happening." The whispers seemed to grow more frenzied, overlapping one another until they were a maddening cacophony. Claire's pulse quickened as she glanced at the walls. They were alive with movement, tiny, imperceptible shifts that made the whole house seem like it was breathing, expanding, contracting. And then the voices began to change. They were no longer distant murmurs. They were calling out, louder now, more distinct. One by one, the whispers took form, saying names, their names. Jake. Mark. Evelyn. Each name was drawn out in a slow, almost mocking tone, as though the house was enjoying their fear. Claire's blood ran cold when she heard her own name whispered from the walls, soft at first, but soon growing louder, more insistent. "Claire..." She backed up, shaking her head. "We need to get out of here. It's trying to..." Another door slammed behind them, louder than before, followed by a long, agonized moan that reverberated through the house. The whispers turned into harsh, rasping breaths, echoing from every corner. The walls trembled. "We have to find another way out," Evelyn said, her voice tight with panic. "The front door is too far. Maybe there's a back door." "I don't care what door we find," Jake said, his voice barely controlled. "As long as we get out of here." Mark nodded, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Follow me. If the front door is blocked, there's always the kitchen. There's got to be a way out there." They rushed down the hallway, but every step felt heavier, slower, as if the house was draining their energy with each passing second. The walls pressed in tighter, and the air was thick with the weight of something unseen, something hungry. Suddenly, Claire stopped in her tracks. The floor beneath her feet felt soft, spongy, like it was giving way. She glanced down and gasped. The wooden floorboards had darkened, warped, as if they were rotting from the inside. Black, viscous liquid seeped up between the cracks, and with it came the stench of decay. "Go!" Mark shouted, his eyes wide with terror as the walls began to groan under the weight of their twisted transformation. "We have to!" But before he could finish, the ground beneath Claire cracked with a deafening snap, and the floor gave way beneath her feet. She screamed as she fell. The last thing she saw was the others reaching for her, their faces twisted in horror, before she disappeared into the blackness below. Claire hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Pain shot through her side, and for a moment, she lay there gasping, struggling to draw in a breath. The world around her was nothing but darkness, cold and suffocating. The whispers that had plagued the walls above were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. She groaned, pushing herself up onto her hands and knees. Her flashlight had clattered out of reach, its beam flickering weakly in the distance, barely illuminating the surrounding gloom. The air down here was damp, heavy with the smell of mold and rot. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of where she had fallen. Above her, she could hear the faint, panicked voices of her friends. "Claire!" Jake's voice, distant and muffled. "Claire, are you okay?" She tried to respond, but her voice came out as a croak. I'm here," she managed, her voice barely audible in the vast space below. "I'm fine." As she reached for her flashlight, her hand brushed against something cold and slimy. She jerked back, her skin crawling with revulsion. Slowly, she angled the beam of light toward whatever she had touched. A hand. Pale, skeletal fingers reaching out from the dirt, twisted and contorted as if frozen in a final, desperate grasp. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the light revealed more, a tangle of bones half buried in the damp earth, long since decayed, their clothes rotting away in tatters. Human remains. She scrambled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She had fallen into some kind of hidden cellar or crypt, and it was filled with the bodies of those who had been lost to Hallow Manor. "Oh my God," she whispered, choking on the words. "No." The light flickered again, and the shadows seemed to shift. Claire's pulse quickened as she realized she wasn't alone. The darkness around her stirred, and from the corners of the room, she could see faint, ghostly figures emerging, hazy shapes that flickered in and out of focus like dying flames. They were people, or at least they had been once. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, their eyes sunken and lifeless. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out, just the eerie, ceaseless motion of lips mouthing silent words. Their bodies were twisted, some reaching out toward her, others collapsed in grotesque positions on the floor. They were the spirits of those who had been trapped in Hallow Manor, those who had been lured into its depths and never escaped. Claire froze, her heart slamming against her ribs as she watched the figures drift toward her. The closest one, a young woman with dark, matted hair and tattered clothing, reached out with skeletal fingers, her eyes wide and full of unspeakable pain. "Help us!" the woman rasped, her voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. It was the first sound Claire had heard from any of them. "Please, help us." Claire staggered back, her hands shaking. I don't know how," she stammered. "I don't—" More voices joined the first, the ghostly chorus growing louder, pleading, begging. "Save us! Free us!" Claire shook her head, her panic rising as the ghosts pressed closer, their translucent hands brushing against her skin, cold as ice. "I don't know how," she cried, tears stinging her eyes. "I can't help you!" The young woman's face twisted with sorrow, her eyes darkening as she whispered, "Then you will stay with us." Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder, more frantic, rising from the walls, the floor, the very air around her. The temperature plummeted, and Claire felt a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest, as if the house itself was closing in, trying to crush her beneath its curse. The ghosts surrounded her now, their faces twisted with desperation, their hands clawing at her, pulling her toward them. She could feel their pain, their torment, centuries of suffering and entrapment within the walls of Hallow Manor. Above her, the ceiling groaned, and Claire could hear her friends shouting, their voices barely audible over the deafening roar of the house. They were trying to find her, but the house was changing, shifting, pulling them further away. In the midst of the chaos, Claire's hand brushed against something cold and metallic. She glanced down, her flashlight beam catching the glint of an old iron key, half buried in the dirt next to the skeleton she had seen earlier. Without thinking, she grabbed it, her fingers trembling as she lifted it from the ground. The moment she did, the ghosts recoiled, their hollow eyes widening in recognition. "That's it," the young woman whispered, her voice barely audible. The key to end it." Claire stared at the key in her hand, her mind racing. What do I do with it? But the ghosts were fading, their forms dissolving into the darkness once more. "Find the lock," the woman's voice echoed. "Free us, or stay forever." The cold air around her grew still, and the spirits vanished, leaving Claire alone in the darkness, clutching the ancient key that might be her only way out. Above, the house groaned again, and she could hear her friends calling her name, but they sounded impossibly far away. Claire clutched the iron key tightly in her trembling hand, its cold weight anchoring her to the moment. The house around her seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the walls groaning as though alive. Her heart pounded as she tried to get her bearings in the pitch-black crypt, the flashlight casting long shadows against the crumbling stone walls. She had no idea where the lock the ghosts spoke of could be, but she knew one thing for certain. This key was her only chance to escape. Above, the muffled cries of her friends sounded distorted, as though they were far away, even though she knew they couldn't be more than a floor above her. The house was playing with them, twisting space and time to keep them separated. Her breath quickened as panic clawed at the edges of her mind, but she forced herself to stay calm. If she lost control, the house would win. "Claire!" Mark's voice pierced the gloom, faint but frantic. "Where are you?" "I'm down here," she shouted, her voice echoing in the suffocating darkness. "I'm coming." She stumbled to her feet, her legs shaking as she tried to find a way out of the crypt. Her flashlight flickered, and in that brief stutter of light, she saw something, a narrow archway, half hidden by fallen stones, leading deeper into the house's foundations. It wasn't the way she had come, but something about it felt important. Without another thought, she squeezed through the narrow gap, her flashlight illuminating the stone passage ahead. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and the dampness in the walls seemed to seep into her bones. Every step she took echoed unnervingly, the sound bouncing off the stone in strange, unnatural ways. As she moved further into the passage, the whispers began again. Faint at first, but growing louder with every step. The voices of the dead seemed to swirl around her, urging her forward. "Find the lock," they whispered. "Free us." Claire's hands tightened around the key. The ghosts had shown her the way. They needed her to break the curse that bound them to this house. She just had to figure out how. The passage twisted and turned in impossible ways, leading her deeper into the bowels of the manor. It felt like hours had passed, though she knew it had only been minutes. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a wide circular chamber. In the center stood an old, ornate door made of black iron, covered in the same strange symbols she had seen on the mirror in the attic. The door radiated a sinister energy, as though it had been sealed for centuries, holding something unspeakable behind it. Her hand shook as she approached, the whispers now a cacophony in her ears. The iron key grew heavier, almost burning her skin with its cold. She glanced around the room, heart racing, half expecting the spirits to return, but they remained silent now, waiting. "This has to be it," she muttered under her breath. "It has to be." With trembling fingers, she inserted the key into the door's lock. The moment the metal touched the iron, a sharp click echoed through the chamber, and the entire room seemed to shudder. The lock turned with a grinding noise, and the door swung open with a slow, ominous creak. Behind it was darkness, an impenetrable void that seemed to swallow the light of her flashlight. But there was something else, too. A presence. It filled the air with an icy chill, far colder than before. Claire took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. Before she could move, a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was the same woman from the attic, the one whose ghost had spoken to her. But now she was fully solid, her eyes burning with an eerie light. She was no longer pleading for help. She was smiling, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent a surge of dread through Claire's veins. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice low and smooth, "for freeing me." Claire's blood ran cold. What are you?" The woman took another step forward, the shadows clinging to her like a living thing. "I am what the house has kept locked away for centuries. I'm the darkness that feeds on this place. And now, thanks to you, I am free." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "No, I didn't mean..." The woman laughed, a sound that echoed through the chamber like the rattling of bones. "Oh, but you did. And now, you will take my place. You will become the keeper of Hallow Manor." Before Claire could react, the door behind the woman slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing her fate. The walls of the chamber began to close in, the cold intensifying until it felt like her skin would freeze solid. "Claire!" Mark's voice was closer now, just beyond the walls. "We're coming." But it was too late. The darkness was already creeping toward her, consuming everything in its path. The house had chosen her, just as it had chosen so many others before. She could feel the curse settling over her, wrapping around her like chains. The last thing she heard before the shadows took her was the sound of her friends pounding on the door, their voices desperate and terrified. Then, there was nothing but silence. Outside, the wind howled through the trees as Hallow Manor stood, silent and still, its secrets buried once again. And within its walls, the house whispered a new name. Claire. She was part of it now, one more ghost, bound to the manor's curse for eternity.